Professor Ranjana Das. She is in Media and Communication. She is from University of Surrey. Her topic is, But a Baby is a Blessing. You Mustn't Feel This Way. South Asian migrant mothers in the UK and their experiences of new motherhood. The session is of 1 hour, 45 to 50 minutes of talk, followed by an interactive session of 10 to 15 minutes. Now may I request Professor Das to deliver a lecture. Thank you, ma'am.
Fantastic. Thank you so much once again for inviting me. And there's a particular personal connection I have with this event because I myself was a student of Lady Brabourne College many years ago now, and I have fond memories. So as I join you today from Guildford in Surrey in the United Kingdom, a little bit of my heart is still in India. So I'm going to share my slides in a bit, and hopefully it's going to work. Right, okay, so I am not familiar with Google Meetings. Can you talk me through how I share my slides? If I click on the arrow here, it's not showing me my slide deck, which is open.
There is an arrow here. You can see that present now.
Yeah.
Just click on that.
Do you see anything now? Do you see my slide deck?
No, not yet. Not yet.
Not yet? Okay.
Not yet.
Trying again. So hopefully, do you see anything now?
No, ma'am.
That's strange.
It's about to begin. It's about to begin.
Yeah, okay. So I think you should be able to see the slide deck now, right?
Yes, it is
perfect.
visible.
Okay, well, again, thank you for coming here today, and I'm delighted to talk to you today about a specific research project that I conducted with a few colleagues of mine, and it was funded by the Wellcome Trust in the UK and the British Academy. Now, before I get into the talk that I will give today, I just wanted to lay out a little bit of the context in which I work and the kind of work that I do. So first of all, I speak today as a social scientist, and my entire career so far has really been about exploring people's uses of technologies and media. Now that's taken many, many forms. I have researched media audiences, starting with audiences of the Bengali serials and soap operas many years ago in Calcutta, right up to a whole load of other things, including, of course, the use of digital technologies. But today, though, I'm going to focus on my last few years of work in a department of sociology, where I have been looking at people's uses of digital technologies, but in the context of family life and parenthood and becoming parents. So that's an important thing to establish, that my talk today focuses very particularly on parenthood and becoming mothers. And I sit as a scholar of technologies and communication in a department of sociology. And equally important, I think, is to share a couple of things about my context in which I work. So my work and the work that I'll speak about today is set in the context of the United Kingdom. Now, and England specifically. So all the research I've done, all the field work, the interviews, the qualitative research that I do is set in the United Kingdom. Now, two things about this require attention. One, the UK has universal healthcare, something called the NHS, the National Health Service. It is a free at the point of use health service that anybody can access. There are private medical providers, but the NHS provides the country's main healthcare. So my children were born on the NHS, etc. So when you see in my talk references to midwives, doctors, hospitals, or the NHS, what we are referring to is this free of cost, at the point of use, free of cost, taxpayer-funded health service. The second thing that I wanted to draw attention to is that, much like the rest of the world, the UK has seen a very rapid adoption of digital technologies. A very rapid proliferation of forums, apps, websites, numerous things with which apparently everybody is going digital. And note my emphasis on the word apparently. So with these two very important contextual factors in mind, free at the point of use healthcare for absolutely anybody living in the UK, and rapid adoption of the digital. These two contextual factors are really key, and they will matter in what I'm about to present. So my talk today refers to a project I did a couple of years ago that looked particularly at South Asian migrant women in the UK and their experiences of new motherhood, their experiences of what I call the perinatal period. So pregnancy, childbirth, and the year after birth. So that entire period, from pregnancy to actually having the baby, complications potentially after having a baby, that whole period is called the perinatal period. And in that period, in England, women have many, many encounters and interfaces with the NHS, the National Health Service. So this particular project was funded partly by the British Academy and partly by the Wellcome Trust. And it looked into the very specific experiences of South Asian women giving birth and having babies in the UK. And the line at the top, "But a baby is a blessing, you mustn't feel this way," is a really key finding that I'm going to come back to, that really makes us think about gender. And it makes us think about how the role of the woman as a mother is constructed in ways that are not good for her, in ways that are even harmful for her. And I'm going to come back to that in a little bit. So, two research questions guided my project. First, and undoubtedly that's the one I'm going to focus on most today, what are migrant mothers' experiences of communicating about their difficulties? So postnatal depression, postnatal anxiety, complications with having babies, their entirety of their difficulties that they might experience in that period. What are these women's experiences of communicating about these things when they go through that in England? Second, and this is the bit that I'm not going to be able to spend that much time on today, what role, if at all, do digital technologies play in that process of finding information and support? Now, one of the key things, I guess, to think about is why this emphasis on the perinatal. So in the UK, there has been a lot of talk and a lot of recognition that is really good about mental health and about the range of mental health and well-being difficulties that new mothers might experience in that period. And as part of that, most of the findings have shown that there's a lot of research on mental health and white women, for example, or mental health and, say, women who are native to the United Kingdom, but much less on the big influx of migrant mothers and migrant women who have arrived in the UK either as first-generation migrants or as second-generation migrants and so on. So this particular project was very interested in finding out about their experiences. The second aspect to mention is that although there has been this broader recognition of the need for support for new motherhood, for pregnancy, for maternity, and for mental health, there has been evidence that the care that is provided to women in this period tends to have these sort of cultural blind spots. So there tends to be these gaps in communication between, say, a healthcare professional, say a midwife or a health visitor, and a woman from a migrant background. So in this particular project, much like the rest of my career as a qualitative social scientist, I was interested in people's lived experiences. I wasn't interested necessarily in quantifying these things or counting these things, but as a qualitative social scientist, I was interested in going into their homes, spending time with them, interviewing them, and I had a fantastic research support assistant who helped with much of that fieldwork. And much like the rest of my work, in this project too, the main data was interviews, long in-depth, detailed interviews with women in their homes, with a very small number of people interviewed online. So the findings I'm going to present to you today and the conclusions I'm going to draw from these projects relate to this body of data, with a very small number of them, about 38 women interviewed in their homes. These women came from a range of countries of origin, and in this talk I'm going to focus mainly on the bulk of my participants who came from various South Asian countries, including, of course, India. And there was a mix of first and second generation immigrants in the final sample. The broader projects, both coupled together, involved a total of 68 mothers, but I'm going to focus on a smaller subset of that today. So I'm going to use selective instances of quotes from their interviews to illustrate my broad findings. So the findings are broad across my entire body of data, but the quotes I'll use to illustrate will come from whoever I'm focusing on. I should say at this point that, like all projects with human participants, this project too needed full ethical clearance from the University of Surrey. It went through a many months long ethical approval process because it was focusing on sensitive issues like mental health, because it was focusing on things like pregnancy and giving birth. And many rounds of to and fro and question and answer followed between me and the ethics committee to make sure this project was safe for the participants and that it was safe for me. And as part of my ethical commitments to my participants, everybody's names have been anonymized. All the names I will use in this presentation, all the names you will see on the slides are not the real names of anybody who participated in the study. And if anybody shared any other identifying details, such as their address or location or the names of their children, everything has been anonymized. So if you see anybody's name, that is not their name. Okay. So the first thing that conceptually I wanted to draw attention to is that despite a lot of attention here in England on this group migrant mothers, I queried that. I questioned this blanket category. Who is a migrant? Who are you talking about? Are you talking about somebody who has come from a relatively privileged context, say in New Delhi or Calcutta, and has recently moved and might find a certain set of difficulties, but might be quite privileged in other ways? Are you talking about somebody who is not economically self-reliant, needs to rely on somebody else for money, and who lacks many privileges that might be taken for granted by another migrant mother, for example? So who are you talking about? So really querying the site of analysis and saying, hey, migrant mothers is not a given umbrella category that you can just apply to absolutely anybody. So let's begin by undoing our categories in the first place. It's so easy to just say migrant mothers without thinking about who exactly are you talking about, because there's race, there's social class, there's a whole load of other variables that complicate that category. And as my research showed, indeed, whilst the entirety of the participants were migrant mothers, there were huge differences in their in their life circumstances, in their context, in the range of difficulties they experienced, and their abilities to advocate for themselves, their abilities to speak up for themselves, their abilities to be listened to. So the first thing to remember is it isn't a blanket category. It is a distinct site of analysis, don't get me wrong. It's a significant thing to do to be in the United Kingdom and to specifically focus on the experiences of migrant mothers going through pregnancy and childbirth. It is a significant and distinct task, yes, but as a subset, it is not a homogeneous umbrella category. So just to refer to a bit of the context, the Race and Equality Commission in the UK identified that there is a big gap regarding the impact of cultural factors on maternal health and mental health. And there was also recognition that existing structures in England's National Health Service are very, very geared towards Western women, women from white Western contexts and their kind of experiences, whereas migrant mothers and their language and cultural barriers were hampering their need for support. So many of them were not even being able to go to the doctor or go to the midwife. And I'll get into why. And language is not the only reason, as we will find out. So there was a broad policy level recognition of a gap. And I began by querying that gap, by recognizing this gap is important, but also querying this blanket category of migrant mothers as this umbrella term. Because just like I said, it is not a homogeneous category. So the evidence so far said that women from ethnic minority backgrounds in the UK, women of color, women from Black or non-white backgrounds and South Asian backgrounds or Asian backgrounds do not receive adequate support in the UK because on occasion there is a lack of awareness, yes. On occasion there are cultural expectations and stigma and taboos around mental health, yes. But also, there are culturally unsavvy, insensitive, or dismissive health services who they are encountering. So think about this. Say you are somebody who finds themselves in the UK, who does not feel able to advocate for herself for whatever reasons. And then you start experiencing significant postnatal depression. You have a language barrier and you feel shy or embarrassed and unable to communicate about it. So that's the first problem. You are encountering difficulties in communication. Second, your broader family around you in the UK are telling you, hey, don't tell anybody that you might have depression. There's a taboo about it. What will people say? So you keep quiet about it because say your in-laws have told you, shh, don't tell anybody. What are people going to say? That's the second aspect. And then third, say you overcome those issues and you manage to find a health visitor or a midwife or a doctor to speak to. You are then met with dismissive or not understanding or insensitive or just a bit of a jarring encounter with the health services. So there are numerous problems which have been recognized in the literature and what I have indicated with the Race and Equality Commission's report and the paper cited here, this was a recognized gap when I began. So scholars, for instance, up there, as you see on the screen, had already found that first generation and non-citizen migrant women were more likely to develop depression at this time. Scholars have also found that poorer socioeconomic conditions or situations of abuse or forced migration even further augment difficulties. And particularly that there were difficulties establishing relationships with midwives. So these findings existed already when my project was funded. So as I have said just then, migrant mothers is not a homogeneous grouping. There are numerous different shades of privileges and intersecting privileges and all sorts of things making this a complicated category. So a really key thing for me when I began was to recognize that yes, this is an important and distinct and pressing site of analysis, but no, everybody is not the same. And that was a balance to draw. So whilst it was crystal clear that ethnic minority women were facing increased risks, and whilst it was crystal clear that ethnic minority women were finding less help, less support when facing these risks, there were all these other complicating factors: class, race, privileged, context of migration, degree of isolation, the range to which you were connected through online means. All of these things made people's experiences really very different. So hopefully that's laid out the context a little bit of the UK. That's laid out the context of this particular focus on ethnic minority women and migrant women in the UK. And hopefully that's also laid out the policy context in the UK, which was great on the one hand with all the focus on maternity and pregnancy and mental health, but not so great on the other hand in terms of the experiences of people who were not born in the UK and who were not from the UK in terms of their countries of origin and cultures of origin. So I'm now going to turn my attention to some of the findings from this project. And once again, I'd like to repeat, just to reassure everybody of the ethics of this, that whilst you will see quotations from these interviews with these mothers with names attached, these names are not real names. Okay, so I quite like beginning with a top-line summary of my findings. First, I found that there was a lot of talk in these interviews about a baby is a blessing. And when probed further, it turned out that all these women had been told, largely by their mothers and by their mothers-in-law, that a baby is a blessing. You mustn't complain. So there were these expectations and understandings of mother as the eternal sacrificer. Mother must sacrifice. Mother's well-being, mother's own health, mental health, does not matter. So there was this big invoking of maternal sacrifice for the celebrity child, so to speak, where the fetus and the infant and the child is the absolute, the celebrity in the room, so to speak, to the extent that repeatedly in numerous parts of England, and this project did its fieldwork in Manchester, in Birmingham, down in Guildford, in loads of parts, in different areas, but this one thing was coming up repeatedly, that a baby is a blessing. You must not complain. Even if you're struggling, even if you find yourself really not coping with the pressures of, significant mental health difficulties, or even anything, less diagnosable, so to speak, you mustn't complain. A baby is a blessing. Secondly, whilst there was a lot of broader talk in the United Kingdom about the impact of isolation in this period, and there was a lot of conversation about go and talk to people, have lots of family or friends around you. Actually, in this particular context, though, many of these women felt isolated whilst being in a crowd of relatives, because it is from that crowd of relatives, largely in-laws, it turned out, that most of the pressures were emerging. So in theory, they were surrounded by lots of people. In practice, it is these lots of people where the pressures were emerging from. Third, there were particular difficulties seeking help if there was any indication that the help being sought is not physical help. If the help required was around emotional well-being or mental health, there was a massive amount of stigma associated with it. And there was a huge roadblock facing many of these women where they felt completely unable to even talk to their doctor because they have been prohibited from doing so. A lot of these women could not advocate for themselves sitting in England, could not step out of the house to go and talk to their GP for a free to use health service that does not cost you anything to use, because of the constant reminders about what will people say. And fourth, there were significant difficulties surrounding interactions with professionals. So I'm going to now get into these in some depth, and I'm going to use quotes to help illustrate to you what some of these findings were. And my hope here is that whilst this research is done in a completely different context, and it is done in the United Kingdom, and that is thousands of miles away from India, there might be similarities around gender, around social constructions of motherhood, around broader familial pressures on women to be a certain way, to mother a certain way, these expectations of maternal sacrifice and the celebrity child that might translate across contexts. The second set of findings I wanted to highlight was around the complex role of digital technologies. And again, In the UK, there is a big assumption that, hey, we are a digital society. Everybody's digital, everybody is online. But actually, in reality, I found that there was massive diversity. So it could very well be the case that on a census type exercise, a household is connected to broadband and Wi-Fi, but that doesn't mean that particular woman is necessarily connected. Even if she's connected, it doesn't mean that she has access to everything that she does need to access. It could be that her husband is controlling her internet access. It could be that she's in a financially abusive situation where she doesn't have the means to top up her phone for mobile data. So these intricacies, the reality on the ground of people's access to digital technologies in the UK's digital society was a big revelation, because people's access could not be guaranteed. And you couldn't assume that just because somebody had a smartphone, that they had the freedom, the privacy, the money to actually use that smartphone to, I don't know, pick up the phone and talk to their midwife, or have a frank conversation with their doctor, or have the privacy in their house to talk openly to a nurse. So these were things you only figure out when you have these long conversations with women, when you go inside their homes, when you read the transcripts repeatedly to find out what really is going on. Because on pen and paper, these women were fine. They had lots of people around them. The household had a broadband connection. Tick, tick, tick. But in reality, the picture was much different. Okay, so I'm now going to get into some of the quotes from these women. So one of the first findings I talked about was this discourse of a baby is a blessing. Motherhood is a blessing. You must not complain. You must sacrifice yourself, and you must sacrifice your own well-being because your baby is a blessing. Now, this came across as the topmost overarching finding in every single interview up and down the country. From different families, different cities, different towns, women from different backgrounds, all said that invariably when they began to struggle, somebody or the other had reminded them, your baby is a blessing, you mustn't complain. And this created a huge amount of pressure on women not even recognizing their struggles, particularly mental health struggles, as legitimate. So Kavya, again, not her real name, says, I think one of the worst things about it was that you're not really meant to talk about it, because you're meant to be so happy that you've given birth and you love your child and you've got this blessing. And obviously, you know, and she was talking about why she got postpartum depression that eventually evolved into something very significant and serious, and it got very bad before she got help. And when looking back at it and speaking about how and why she couldn't seek help, there was this enormous sense of guilt. But I was told my baby is a blessing. I mustn't complain. Now, many participants reported a lack of awareness about mental health difficulties within the wider community, and often a lot of stigma, particularly stigma in relation to speaking to a HCP, by which I mean a healthcare professional, a doctor, a nurse, or just anybody. Remember, it's a free healthcare service. This is free, it's taxpayer funded, free at the point of use. I mean, so there isn't a financial roadblock there. So Shona says, they outcast you totally. They don't do anything. You are treated differently. And again, up and down the country, across different homes, conversations repeatedly came back to, the baby is a blessing, yes, and I mustn't complain, but also I mustn't tell the doctor. I mustn't go to anybody. I mustn't tell anybody. Nobody must know, because what will people say? That was another quotable quote that repeatedly came up. What will people say? In particular, older generations very often were reported to contribute to the development of these difficulties by the imposition of these expectations and these perceptions on women's lives, and sometimes even superstitions on their lives. Now, one of the things I should highlight at this point is, when I started, I said there was a mismatch between the National Health Service and the pregnancy and maternity care it provides in general, and the particular experiences of these women. Because one of the things that happens in the pregnancy and maternity period is in that big checklist of questions they are meant to ask you, one of the things they ask you is, do you have people around you? Because that is taken as an indicator of social isolation. So if you say, no, I don't have too many people around me, that would be an indication that you're isolated. But if you say, yes, I have lots of people around me, then they think, oh, that's fine. And that is a great example where things are going wrong, because that is a great example of culturally insensitive or incompetent care. Because for these women, if they were asked this tick box question of, do you have lots of people around you? They would say, yes, I have lots of people around me. And the healthcare provider would think, yeah, that's okay then. But clearly, all was not okay. These women had lots of people around them. And these were the people, though, who were repeatedly telling them, don't speak to a doctor, don't speak to a nurse. What will people say? A baby is a blessing. So these two things were common to a whole range of the interviews that I did. So lots of women's stories repeatedly came back to this kind of stigma. And interestingly, when women spoke about these things, when we read back through the transcripts of the interviews, so embedded and so ingrained was the stigma and the guilt that women's own self-conceptions were very much that I must sacrifice absolutely everything for the sake of my child, and I must not complain. So it was a really embedded feeling. Now, the third thing that came across was, even if there were instances where women felt able to advocate for themselves, so where they felt able to ignore auntie-in-law or able to ignore mum or mum-in-law, and that's a big if, right? It's a big if. If all the elders in your family are repeatedly telling you don't actually have a problem, you mustn't go and speak to the doctor because your baby is a blessing, it does wear you down. If it didn't wear her down and she did feel that something isn't quite right, I need some support, many of the mums reported not having had sufficient time to rest after giving birth due to social pressures. Many of them reported, on the one hand, living in England, which has a certain amount of gender equality in terms of mothers and fathers sharing responsibilities, but they found themselves living in these more joint families where they were still expected to cook for everybody. So they were living in a context where other mothers were not experiencing these things necessarily, but in that small microcosm, they were still experiencing these very patriarchal gendered pressures of not finding enough time to rest after giving birth and having to constantly provide, whilst men were not pulling their weight and not doing their fair share. So there was a huge amount of cultural contradictions going on, because everybody else around you seemed to be okay living in the United Kingdom, where lots of dads were taking shared parental leave, and there was a high amount of sort of domestic gender equality. Still a long road to go, but on the one hand, there was a lot of that outside, but within her own unit, it felt like a big jarring difference. Then, despite lots of people around her, and this is where that indicator of social isolation, where women are asked, do you have lots of people around you, doesn't quite work. It turned out that despite having an extensive familial network at home, the lack of stimulating activities and being cooped up at home made things even worse. So Tara said, I want to get out of the house. I feel like I'm stuck. I need to get out of the house. I need to put her in a school or a nursery. She was desperate. I need to get my life back. I need to get my career back on track. But she was prohibited and prevented from doing so. So a lot of the possible networks were also cut off for many of these women. Work networks, friendship networks, going out of the house networks. A lot of this was cut off. And across the range of the data, these factors were repeatedly cited as contributing to difficulties. Proximity of in-laws, religious taboos and restrictions, superstition, a high emphasis of tradition in the family, arranged or abusive marriages, and lack of a supportive partner. And to add to that, not being able to talk about this to absolutely anybody, because remember, what will people say? Some secondary factors also came into play. Giving birth to a baby of a sex viewed as less desired within the community. Remember, in the context of the UK, there's a big jarring difference here, because that's almost like everybody else has moved on from these things in the UK. But within a particular microcosm, there were many pressures to produce a baby of a particular sex. Strong perceptions of themselves as providers and independent and sociable and providing for everybody, cooking for everybody, etc. A recent change of residence, so newly arrived migrant women, first generation migrants, had a greater level of difficulties. And finally, a history of miscarriage or birth problems. Many of these women had had traumatic births, or something had gone wrong in labor, or sometimes there had been a miscarriage. And again, that broader community of family members, the broader community of in-laws, had blamed her for things that are completely out of her control. And these factors also had an important role to play. Now, there were also problems, though, that weren't just about the broader community. There were problems with the institutions they were encountering, the health services. So Edna said, they send you a list of places you can go to for play groups, but it's very hard to go out when you're in certain states of depression. They found it difficult to communicate the problems that they were experiencing, because they didn't know where to go. And when they were in the pits of depression, they couldn't even bring themselves to step outside of the house. So again, there's a mismatch between reality and paper. On paper, there are loads of services, loads of playgroups, loads of baby centers, this and that in the UK. In reality, these mothers were at home and unable to even step out of the house, let alone seek help or advocate for themselves. Support groups. The UK is known for loads and loads of support groups. Mum and baby groups, they're called, where lots of mums can come together with their babies and play with each other. Many of my participants, though, were not even aware of their existence, which means something has gone wrong in the communication in the UK, where the communication about these things is only going out to certain sections of society. And only certain sections of society are feeling able to attend these things, because these services exist, free at the point of use. But a very specific community is not even aware of their existence and not feeling able to attend them. So one mum here, Tanaya, says, I think seeing other mums, interacting with other mums, seeing him happy playing, being able to talk to other mums, it helped a lot. But she was an exception. So something has gone slightly wrong in the communication about these services in an apparently highly developed country, in a country with apparently free at point of use healthcare, and in a country where apparently technologies are 100% taken up, and in a country where apparently there is a lot of support for pregnancy and maternity. The picture on the ground is different. The picture on the ground is unequal, and it is unequal in disproportionately against women of a certain background. And my final strand of findings, after which I am going to stop and take questions, is that support was often found to be taboo itself. So medication was treated as very, very bad to take and very harmful. So Nia says, doctors offered me medicine, but I said no at the time, because there's this big taboo about seeking actual medical help. There was a lot of anxiety around involving social services or getting involved with or telling doctors or nurses, because there was this misconception that people might take your baby away, which is not the case. It is not the case, but there are all these many taboos that sometimes families encouraged. So women at their most vulnerable states were often told by family members, never tell your doctor that you're feeling badly. They might take your baby away. This is not true, though, but it was a symptom of something broader happening there around the you mustn't tell anybody discourse that I spoke about. Despite all this, there was a wide acknowledgement of the NHS, the National Health Service, as providing a very useful, beneficial service. Nurses were trusted, midwives were trusted. And the fact that they didn't have much time to talk to each individual woman was recognized by these mothers as a broader issue of how series of government policies have underfunded the health service. They did not take that personally as, okay, this particular nurse doesn't want to spend more than 10 minutes with me. They understood that in a taxpayer-funded healthcare environment, time was precious. And another thing that really came across, and this was a finding to feed back into the health service, was that all these mothers felt that the health visitors were more focused on ticking boxes on forms than really understanding what was going on. So Arshi says, I know the nurses have got a lot of things to do, but what needs to change is that they need to actually spend time with the woman that's had the baby. And this came across in my other projects too. There was a lot of recognition that just ticking some boxes on a questionnaire was not identifying the issue at hand. And the example I gave you earlier about that, do you have lots of people around you matter? It's a great example, because it's a perfect example where somebody can say, yes, I have a lot of people around me, and that's it. But it's the people around me that's causing the problem in the first place. Mothers generally also felt that in the health service, their own well-being was often neglected, where the focus was entirely on the baby's growth and the baby's development. So Anushka says here that I know midwives and GPs and health visitors, they check the baby, but not everybody checks the mother in depth. So there's a broad line to be drawn then between the institution's perception of the role of the woman and the family's perception of the role of the woman, where the baby, it has been theorized in sociology as the fetal celebrity, where the child is the celebrity, the fetus is the celebrity, but where the mother symbolizes maternal sacrifice. And another point that was noted was, of course, in this chaotic system of healthcare where there was lack of staffing, lack of time, the woman was seeing a different midwife every time. There wasn't a designated point of contact. So if she opened up to somebody and managed to say that I am really struggling, or my husband is abusive, or I'm in a deeply financially abusive situation, or I don't have control of my passport, or I don't have a phone, or these horrific stories of abuse, even if she did open up to somebody one time, next time when she met somebody, it was a different person. And this lack of continuity of care also stood in their way. So a lot of different factors, some institutional, some cultural, some familial, came together to create what I started with, what the Race Equality Commission pointed out, that there is a real problem where a particular subset of pregnant women and mothers in England's society are falling particularly behind and are facing a particular subset of struggles. I'm going to skip very briefly over the next part of my findings, because as I said, my presentation today focused on the sociological and not so much on the digital, but a few top line findings to note that in general, women appeared isolated. And although the household had Wi-Fi and the household had broadband, it didn't mean that they had the privacy to have a video chat with someone. They were surrounded by people. It didn't mean that they necessarily had the money to top up the mobile data on their phones. Many of them were relying on their husbands to give them small little bits of money. So actually, in the UK's digital society, with a lot of rhetoric and a lot of hyperbolic talk about universal access, in reality, the picture was very different. Many of these women were technically and sociologically and socially isolated because of a lack of access in a different way. When we spoke to healthcare professionals and they listened to these findings, they said that they were very disappointed and said, if we could go back and change things, we would change things. If I knew, I would change my practice. It was very mechanical then. If I knew, I would have tried to develop a relationship by visiting women at home for longer. Many times in the meetings, the woman was accompanied by her husband or by the mother-in-law. They couldn't talk properly. And the healthcare professional couldn't ask this person to leave because this woman had been told at home, clearly, you must not ask us to go. So even if she was being physically abused or mentally abused, she couldn't use that chance to tell somebody because there was somebody in the room with her. So when healthcare professionals listen to these findings, they acknowledge that, yes, these are genuine difficulties that exist. And I also found that whilst there was a lot of talk about social media, blogs and forums and all these things, actually, many of these women were not on these websites. Many were not sharing with other people anonymously. Many didn't even have a functioning internet connection that they could control because their husbands were topping up their mobile phones, which again was jarring with the experiences of the rest of the UK. So some real questions to be asked about digital access and digital inclusion and digital equality in a digital society, because for whom? All these gaps and all these divides started coming up when I started talking to women about their experiences. So on that note, I'm going to end my talk for today, and I think I've taken up about 50 minutes of my time. Like I said, the internet and digital access was not the focus of my talk, but I've left you on that note as a bit of a teaser. You're very free to ask me questions about that aspect. But more broadly, I've been working with parents and mothers for a long time, and I work with audiences and media users and people's users of technology for an even longer time. So any questions you have, I am most happy to take. And on that note, I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
Words fail to express my gratitude for, undertaking such a pertinent sociological issue, first and foremost. And secondly, thank you so much for your stimulating talk, which is basically on the lived experience of mothers and would-be mothers. And this experience is usually a site of ignorance. So before the participants ask you further questions, ma'am, will you please allow me to ask you something?
Of course, yeah.
Okay, then a quick anecdote. My friend migrated with her husband in UK, and she stayed there for 5 years. When she returned, she was, physically very unwell, and also mentally she was not okay. So I asked her some basic questions. So what's wrong with you? She said, like, Amrita, when I was in UK, after giving birth to the child, I felt like I was when I used to feed my child, I felt like a cow is feeding a calf. Such a bizarre, expression of depression or frustration. I was utterly surprised. And then I simply asked her, were you in a hurry? She said, no, there was a family pressure, and my in-laws specifically wanted a successor with UK citizenship.
Yeah.
So my question is to you, during your, experiences, during your research work, during your interview with the participants, have you ever endured this sort of, expectations of in-laws, like they need to be the UK citizens. They want their grandson or granddaughter to be the UK citizen. That is the prime demand of the in-laws. That's what I want.
Absolutely. Yeah. And this is not just true from people from Indian backgrounds. As I mentioned, many of my participants came from African backgrounds as well. And citizenship definitely featured in quite a few of these conversations. And there were definitely these broader expectations. So when I said there was this notion of what will people say, what that grasps actually is not just what will people say if you seek help for your depression, but also what will people say about X or Y or Z. And also equally, outside of immigration and citizenship issues, there were lots of pressures around the sex of the baby, around producing a male child, particularly.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much. And participants, we are requesting you to post your questions or comments. The session is now open for discussion.
I can see a question that's just come up. Saying, can you please enlighten the reason for the digital divide? Yes, so this is a big one, and thank you for that, because I am, my job is as a researcher of media and communications. I can show you my book here. So my book here, Early Motherhood in Digital Societies, does exactly look at that, but in today's talk, I focused more on the sociological side of things. What is the reason for a digital divide? Look, digital divides have been studied for decades now. And digital divides have been established for, say, the elderly. More young people are online than older people. We know that. And that's true in the UK as well. But particularly, I think the reason these divides exist in the UK are multifold. In the UK currently, there is, as you know, a large amount of immigration and lots of different kinds of cultures coming together, but there are broad disparities. There are high levels of poverty, child poverty in the UK. There are high levels of deprivation, socioeconomic deprivation, and there are very, very contrasting cultures. So amidst all this, when assumptions are made about digital access, they are usually made on certain indicators like broadband access. How many households have broadband? How many households have a smartphone? But that kind of questioning doesn't give us the right kind of answers, though, because you could get information that tells you 99% households have great broadband access. Great. And you could assume from that 99% of the population is entirely digital. But what does that mean? As you saw from my findings, a household can have broadband access, but nobody is guaranteeing that every member of that household has the skills or the literacies or the knowledge to actually benefit from the online, to recognize the risks of the online. I met women who tick was in a household with broadband access, but whose mobile phones, whose actual device was controlled by their partner, who would top it up for £5 a month just to make phone calls to Bangladesh, to her family from whom she was separated. She wasn't allowed to do anything else. She didn't have the grand data plans to go on Facebook groups. She didn't have access to the family's computer because her husband monopolized that. So that is the reality. So these are the factors that come together to create the digital divide. But unfortunately, we don't know enough about these divides because we've ticked the boxes that have counted how many smartphones and how many broadband households. And that is not giving us the right picture. So hopefully that answers your question. Okay, so there's another question I see. Yeah, okay, so this is a good one. And perhaps my colleagues who work in migration particularly and who are sociologists of migration have a better understanding of this, because I'm not a sociologist of migration. But I can say that a lot of conversation in the field is around sort of pockets, right? A lot of first and second generation immigrants find themselves in large families, large migrant families and large communities, where a lot of these traditional structures are replicated in a smaller microcosm. So in many cases, many of these women told me that all their friends and all their day-to-day, everyday people they speak to are still their in-laws, their aunties, their cousins, where everybody knows everybody. It's a small group of people. Because a migrant community so far away from home develops a connection between each other, where people are very closely entwined together, where everybody knows everybody. And being able to step outside of that and to be perceived as rejecting all of that feels like leaving a whole world behind. So geographically, you are 5 minutes from the center of London. Emotionally and socially, you are entirely entwined and embedded within a particular group of pressures and contextual pressures around you to behave and think in a certain way.
Participants, any other questions or your observation or your comments?
Okay, I think I've answered all the questions in the chat, unless I've missed something, but thank you very much, all of you, for the questions and the comments.
Thank you so much, Professor Das, for your lucid presentation with insightful thoughts. There is another question by...
Oh, sorry, yes, there's another question. Did you come across anyone amongst these women who did protest despite their... Yes, of course. I mean, and this is why I said that migrant women On the one hand, it is an important area of analysis, as all the policy speak recognizes. On the other hand, it is a very bad blanket category, because who is a migrant woman? So we know that socioeconomic class, education levels, professional accomplishments made a difference. Now, I'm not saying that people who had higher attainments didn't have any struggles. They did, but their abilities to advocate for themselves. So the question here is whether they were able to protest despite these pressures, whether they were able to advocate for themselves. And that happened for women who had certain privileges. So if a mother had a working life, had a professional life outside of having a baby, if she was financially independent, if she had fewer in-laws around her, or if she had a supportive family of origin of her own, if she had friends and friendship networks that were outside of this sort of a closed community, then yes, there were examples where people did seek help, where people did join groups, where people did A, B, or C. But my point is that this ability to advocate for themselves didn't come from just an individual disposition about person A is weak and person B is strong. It wasn't that. It was that person A was a migrant woman with certain privileges and strengths, and yes, she stood up and spoke, but person B was not from that context and not from that background and couldn't speak up. So there's another question. I think I'm approaching the end of my time, but yes, I am happy to share the slides. And do working migrant mothers also go through the same situations? See, that's a fantastic question. And you've just given me an idea for a new project. But actually, yes, indeed. There were perhaps subtle differences based on whether the person was working. But I suggest here that the working or not working is a bit of a red herring. I don't think, you see, when you're working, you presumably have colleagues. And these colleagues presumably are not all from your community of origin. They are from all kinds of places in the world. Say you are a teacher. You have some friends and colleagues from France, some from Zimbabwe, some from India, some from elsewhere. You meet them every day. You have people to talk to. You get invited to work events. There are Christmas events, meals, work picnics. You have another world. That imparts confidence. That imparts a certain degree of networking. So then when you are in trouble, your family's voice is not the only voice in your head telling you, hey, don't complain. A baby is a blessing, because you know that you could live your life differently. So the working by itself, I don't think is the determining factor, but the fact that you have other networks, other people to talk to, that definitely showed in the interview transcripts. And I think that's all the questions that I have had. But of course, let me know if I've missed anything.
Any other questions?
No, I think not. I think that's it.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much, Professor Das, for gifting us such a brainstorming session. Looking forward to hear you in future again. Thank you, and thank you, participants, for your. Thank you so much. Thank you, participant, for your active participations. And with this note, we conclude today, and we will again meet tomorrow right at 11 in the morning for many more enthralling sessions. Thank you, everyone.